Welcome to the Cybersecurity Matters podcast. Your hosts today are me, Harry Baldwin, and Matt Rose, two members of the cybersecurity team here at Nuco, and we're delighted to be joined today by Alison Eastaway. Alison is a senior people and talent leader with extensive global experience across high growth startups and scale ups. She has led recruitment, people operations, and organizational development across Europe, the US, and beyond. Her background includes leadership roles at startups across the space, including Poolside and Screen, with Screen later being acquired by Datadog. Today, Alison is VP of People and Culture at Push Security, where she leads global people strategy in support of long-term business growth. Welcome to the show, Alison.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, really looking forward to learning a little bit more about your experience, how you got into the industry, and covering lots of things on talent and people. But always on the podcast, we always start with the same question. How did you first get into the cybersecurity industry in the first place?
Yeah, I think by probably the same story as a few other people in the industry, which is entirely by accident. I had worked at two other early stage startups, and the expectation back then, and possibly even still today, is relatively low on people in my position and what they necessarily know about the industry or how technical the product is on that side. So that's a little bit different these days, but I'd worked in sort of tech companies and cybersecurity. I figured I could probably work out, the jargon in the industry from that after having done some telco and some HR tech and some advertising tech.
Yeah, very cool. What appealed to you about cybersecurity specifically? We love the innovation change. It's a little bit crazy the amount of growth in the area, but that really stuck out to me before I moved into security. What was the pull for you? What do you find exciting about it?
Yeah, I think you have to sort of think about who you want to spend your time with and around. And what I found, pretty happily is a lot of cybersecurity professionals, whether that's buyers, so on our ICP side, whether that's, sort of colleagues and peers in the industry, whether that's, security engineers. They've got culturally, it's a very sort of pragmatic, low BS kind of group that are all about the work. And that can't necessarily be, the same can't be said. A lot of people sort of said, okay, why don't you? I'd worked in an HR tech company in an internal role, and they said, well, that must be great because you understand the ICP because you are the ICP and that. And I said, yeah, it's fine. Is it necessarily the only thing you want to think about? Function and that sort of specialist area. So I think for me, the personalities that you come across, everybody's incredibly down to earth. In cybersecurity, everybody's particularly pragmatic. And if you pick the right companies and things like that, there's a very high bar for sort of ethics that goes kind of along with a lot of the cyber stuff that we're doing. Which, if you sort of extrapolate into the things my job encompasses, that's great. Cyber leaders, have a tendency to be far more sort of ethically straight down the line, at least in my experience, and I've seen in some other business areas.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there's a real sense of community, right, in security. We see that when we go to all these conferences. Everyone's always, open to a conversation and loves talking about, protecting people and businesses. So no, it's super interesting. Now we've done our opening question. I'm going to hand over to Matt, who's got some questions about your career so far. Over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Harry. Yeah, really starting with, you've mentioned a little bit about kind of your varied career uh, up until this point. Along the way, has there been anybody or anything specifically that you would highlight as the biggest influence on your career to this point?
Yeah, I think it's probably a combination of factors. So I didn't go to university, or I did very briefly for sort of 6 months. So and I started working when I was 14 years old, which was basically, like the second I could in Australia where I grew up. And I think, basically having that ability to go in and talk people into giving you a job when you're 14, 15 years old is something that I've kind of continued to do throughout my entire career. And I think, feeling like that was possible was almost certainly, something that came from my parents initially. My father didn't finish high school. And had a pretty complicated childhood situation, but managed to essentially work his way up from sweeping the car park at the bank to being a foreign exchange trader to being the chief trader in charge when the Australian dollar was floated. And so I think just having that model of, if you show up and do a good job, that'll get noticed and you'll be able to kind of climb the ranks that way. But what matters is the work ethic. Was something that was really ingrained from day one. And I think also, my sister has 2 university degrees. Neither of my parents have zero between them. And so I think just knowing that there were different paths to success and not sort of one model that you had to follow. I think partly familial, partly cultural. Australians aren't quite as obsessed with higher education as some of our counterparts as well.
Yeah, it's really interesting actually, because you see that growth in people that don't necessarily pick the traditional routes into particular careers. Was that always very clear to you from obviously your family connection of that pathway? And how did that shape your perspective of your career from a young age?
Yeah, I think, you can always make a really nice, logical story in hindsight, right? I think at the time I just really wanted my own money so I could go to the movies and, probably buy singles because, I was born in the 80s, buy, singles and probably, horrible glitter-based makeup products and not have anybody tell me, that I could or couldn't do that. So I think it was really that. It was like, okay, hold on, what's possibly within my own agency to go out and affect, oh, I can get a job. Oh, okay. The hours at the bakery aren't long enough. Could I get a second job at the cafe across the way? Okay, great. Oh, the cafe also has tips. How do I parlay that into something more interesting? So I think it came from a very pragmatic desire for like independence. I grew up in a pretty small, suburban place in Australia pre-internet. So, you've kind of got to, if not, the world isn't going to come to you is probably the way I would put it. And then I think the non-traditional, for me, it just, at least the way university was run in Australia, again, this is kind of pre, MOOCs and online courses and things like that, where you had to be in person for an hour here, 2 hours there, considered full-time, certainly not a full-time load, not optimized from a schedule point of view. And for me, I've always sort of been able to do pretty well if you sort of give me the content and you tell me, figure it out, here's the outcome. And university just didn't make sense to me. I thought we were being rewarded for kind of killing time and sitting and talking about things rather than kind of driving at something. So it wasn't a desire to be different. It was more I couldn't tolerate the pace and what I found illogical in university. I thought, well, if I'm doing university to land a job here, is there another way I can go and land that job that would be faster and essentially more lucrative?
And along the way, since then, obviously you've had fantastic experiences across many different companies. But is there a particular achievement that you think stands out as your biggest achievement of your career so far?
It's really interesting, this idea of achievement, because there are a bunch of different things I could kind of point at. I think probably one of the best illustrations maybe of the type of work I do. Worked for a French American company called Screen, joined them just post Series A. We had a small office in Paris. We were building out an office in San Francisco. We ended up scaling that team and sold to Datadog in a strategic acquisition in 2021. I could point at the acquisition, and the financial impact of that. I think the thing I would point at, though, that means more to me is the fact that was 2021. 5 years ago. The group chat, the Screen group chat, still pings, a few times a week, with people sharing, pictures of their new babies or their new jobs and their new startups, or saying, hey, I'm going to be in this city, which of the former Screen team is around? And that's something I've really not seen before. You certainly, bond more or less with colleagues, situationally while you're there. You might make 1 or 2 really good friends who you carry through, beyond that work experience. But this is, everybody's on that group chat, whoever worked at Screen and wants to be. And, a lot of the team have come back to work together again. It still gets quoted as, this incredible sort of company culture that was really difficult to sort of recreate. And so I think probably that's what I'd point to.
And do you think the HR and people route was always kind of innately in what you were kind of looking for and kind of built into what you thought you'd be good at?
Not in so many words. I mean, I was always interested in what happens behind the scenes. And, you know, in my earlier years, right after high school, you know, I worked for an international hotel chain called Club Med, you know, and it's very, you know, everyone's on show kind of all the time. Everybody's playing a role. And what I was interested in was what happens when, you know, they're off duty for 2 seconds and go around the corner and have a cigarette. Like, what's the real kind of story? So I always like this idea of like what goes on behind the scenes. I'd been a waitress through the latter years of high school, and you know that's kind of difference between how you are in front of a customer and then what gets said while you're scraping a plate into the kitchen with the chef. And so I think I was drawn to that. I think initially I wanted to be involved. I wanted to know what's the inside scoop, what's behind the scenes. Secondly, at least in the early years, I wanted to be paid to travel. That was kind of the two things. So I thought about going into like hotel school and doing things like that since I'd grown up working in hospitality. But I thought, oh, okay, if there's a way to land a role as like a human resources manager in a hotel chain, you know, office job, but, you know, international kind of playing field. That was kind of, I think, the through line. And the reason I actually did start a university degree, I said, well, you probably need a uni degree for that. And then 6 months into the degree, I landed the job I wanted anyway. So I went, okay, well, what's the point in going into a significant amount of debt? Australia is not quite as bad as the United States, but you know, it's still very much, you know, you'll exit with a $60,000, $100,000 kind of loan to pay back, which just didn't seem logical to me. I thought, why am I paying to get a job that I could maybe talk my way into anyway? And so it was just kind of that flickering. So I think, you know, I never sort of dreamt of being in human resources. I just sort of found that there was this, you know, role that existed that could take the things I was good at and I'd probably get paid well for them. So it was more, yeah, a kind of necessary evil to end up in HR.
And I'm really curious from your own perspective, now in the kind of tech startup world, if you've always had this curiosity of kind of what happens behind the scenes and what actually happens across a company, surely at a tech startup where, you know, it feels like every single person is so crucial to the ultimate goal of the company, kind of how that's translated into, you know, your current role and prior tech startup roles too.
Yeah, I think it's, you know, there's a lot of different things that make a company successful. A bunch of them are, you know, market related and resource related from a fundraising point of view. But also, and very much what early stage investors look for in tech startups, it's the team. What is the team that you have managed to assemble from a founding point of view? Who else can you attract in the early days, which means your direct network, or how amazing you are at convincing complete strangers that your idea is sort of worth anything. So, you know, the number one reason why startups, you know, succeed or fail is really the team. You know, co-founder breakups are an inherently human issue. You can, if you've got incredible product market fit, you can get away with crappier culture for longer, for sure. Culture is it's kind of like a savings account. You like invest in it when things are good, so that when you miss a month or a quarter, which you're going to do, there's no way you're going to go through the startup journey and never have that situation happen. Or when, you know, three of your engineers quit, you invest in the culture so that you've got a bit of a cushion in those times. I've seen startups where, you know, they ride the wave of their absolute breakout success because maybe right time, right place. There was a particular wave they were riding. They had great investors. The second something starts to turn, the whole company can fall apart. So it's this idea of, you know, how do you run incredibly quickly at revenue goals and then product delivery goals while also investing in a culture in a time where maybe it isn't that obvious how that's going to pay off down the road. So I think it's kind of, you know, the comparison I make with engineering leaders is you have to like architect your app or your service and think about all the different moving parts. The organization is the same. It's just that the different moving parts have like free will and their own agenda and things like that, which makes it a little bit more interesting.
Yeah, and I think that really neatly leads us on actually to the next part of the podcast that Harry has some questions on, which is to do with people and hiring. I think you've got some fantastic insights across that too.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much for all your answers so far, Alison. I was really taken back by your your number one achievement really being the time at screen, but also how much it's linked to impacting people around you. And you've spoken a number of times already about culture. How do you think businesses can practically create a positive culture? Because it's not always the easiest thing to do. But how do you think businesses can practically create that?
Yeah, I think it starts with like actually caring about it. And I mean that in the most pragmatic sense. If your CEO or your co-founders really kind of think that culture is this kind of fluffy, overdone, like feelings thing, and they're like, they don't have time for it, I almost think the best thing they can do is like lean into that and be honest about it, because you'll still attract people. Like, people are incredibly resilient in the workforce, particularly in this market. People can adapt to all kind of ranges of company cultures. I think what you want to avoid is like a massive gap between who you say you are and who you actually are in practice. I think like the goal of culture is, you know, describe the way you make decisions and the things people are rewarded, punished, or what gets tolerated accurately. If you don't like what you find and you go, oh, geez, we actually never meant to build a company with, where that's exactly who gets rewarded, that's when you can kind of step back and say, okay, what do we need to change so that that's no longer true? And what that looks like in an early stage startup is, who do we hire? Who do we, essentially give feedback to, performance manage, and coach, or move out in the early days? And then afterwards, what is happening in, we're a fully remote company. So what is happening in Slack threads where there isn't somebody from the exec team? What are people saying, when they hang up from the Zoom call? If somebody's family or friends were saying to them, hey, how's the new job going, what words are they using to describe it? And essentially, forever just saying, are we comfortable with that? Can we say, hey, we only reward people who act like team players? If you have any examples that contradict that, people are going to spot it really quickly and call you out. You can't be perfect, and that's why I say you're better off being descriptive initially. And then if there's a thing you want to change where you go, oh, okay, we always thought we were transparent, but actually nobody in the company knows the revenue numbers. You ask them, what are the names of our customers? They can't say to the team, hey, we're going to try and be more transparent, and here's where we're starting, rather than saying, no, we are, the sky isn't blue. That's where people get, I think, a little bit betrayed.
How important do you put culture when you're interviewing candidates? Because I think the classic one is, it's a bit of a stereotype, but the sales leaders will be a little bit more, salespeople will be a little bit more egotistical and driven by money, and engineers can sometimes be a little bit more difficult to read and understand on certain topics, right? But I know everyone's different, and we're always thinking about how we can match people's personalities and cultures to the businesses that we support, because I think that often is what gets people hired in the end. Do you agree with that? Do you have in your process, how much attention do you pay to culture? And do you also think that it's something that you can change about individuals? Because also equally, quite often these people were shaped by their previous experiences, what they look for and don't look for in a culture. So maybe like three questions at once there, but yeah. First off, is it part of your process, and how important do you make it for candidates?
Yeah, I think there was some kind of wisdom maybe 5-10 years ago, which was that you should put everyone through like a specific cultural interview. I don't really subscribe to that sort of school of thought, because I think culture, if it's properly kind of integrated throughout your organization, it also needs to be integrated through every step of your hiring process. If you look at it as a gateway type system, so in theory, somebody who would not be a cultural fit shouldn't make it past a first recruiter screen, because that is part of the gateway that happens there. Now we can get kind of more in the nitty gritty around what's a orange flag versus a red flag, and you can possibly move someone forward and clear out a cultural flag, because interviews are inherently imperfect and subjective, particularly around this topic. So I find the easiest thing to do is sort of be quite descriptive. And what it can usually boil down to in good early stage startups where I've worked is a lack of ego. Ego is a really, really tough thing to contend with. That's something I don't think people can necessarily change as quickly as is required for an early stage startup to function. Because if you're low ego about something, even if your sort of default reactions are not in line with the culture, you'll take the feedback and you'll absorb it and you'll change. And so that's where that's kind of a catch-all. People who are, hardworking and low ego, there's not a whole lot, that falls outside of that bucket of what's possible. So those two things are kind of baseline, I think, for any place, I'd like to work. And then I think it comes down to, there's a bunch of different things. The cybersecurity industry is incredibly dominated by, sort of one population. And, even just the fact of being a female leader can sometimes shake some, things out of candidates that, they might not have otherwise displayed to my male colleagues. So you can tell a lot, I think, in early interviews by, who they direct questions to, do they remember your title, or do they sort of, accidentally down level you and things like that. I think, sales by definition, the way sales compensation plans are defined is inherently individualistic. So you have to have other things that make sure that everyone operates as a team. That's not salespeople's fault. It's just the way that works. And so if you have an individualistic system and then you also have somebody who culturally tends incredibly selfish, that's probably going to be a recipe for disaster. Or you're going to have to, overly engineer processes to get them to behave differently. Whereas culture is much more kind of wide sweeping and helps people make the right decision, even if the process is vague or missing.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. Really interesting.
Sorry to jump in, Harry,
Yeah,
as
go
well.
on, Matt.
I'm really curious to, maybe straying a little bit outside of the talent and hiring side, but actually more the kind of maintenance of culture with existing colleagues at businesses. With the shift to kind of hybrid and remote working, how has your perspective in terms of maintaining culture changed with that alongside that shift?
Yeah, I think it's harder for sure. I think I think I used to say the easiest company setups are either all in office or all remote, and the absolute hardest is hybrid. Just because of the asymmetry that kind of comes from it. I haven't seen anyone do hybrid particularly well, in the truest sense. uh, if people are all co-located in one major city and they do 3 days in office and 2 days at home and everyone does the same schedule, okay, fine, but I would still classify that as like an in-office kind of setup. I think, in the early days of Screen, this is pre-pandemic, we weren't remote. Not many people were at that stage, but we were, we were distributed because we had an office in Paris and an office in San Francisco, and the time difference is massive. So I think a lot of what I learned about how to create culture and enhance it in a remote org, I kind of learned kind of trial by fire at Screen, with such an extreme time difference and cultural difference between French and American teams. I think the hardest thing is surfacing or noticing that there's a problem, because there is no really good equivalent for walking into an office and kind of getting a read of the room, or, waiting your turn at the coffee machine and then kind of overhearing someone's discussion and seeing through a meeting room and going, I should probably check in with the CTO if everything's good, because that meeting just everyone's body language looked tense. There is no equivalent for that remote working unless I spend my life creeping on every team's team meetings, and even so they'll change because I'm in the room. So I think gathering signal on cultural stuff and knowing what might be broken is much harder remote. You end up relying on Slack or email, or having to go basically truffle hunting for that. So that's really difficult. The build of it is not quite as hard, I think, if you're pragmatic around a few things, accepting that if you're fully remote, you are going to have to fly people to the same spot at some point, at some frequency. I think that's just par for the course. So, at Push, we fly everybody once a year somewhere in Europe to get together for a company trip. And that's a huge thing for a cultural moment for, the transmission from people who've been here for years, people who've maybe joined 2 weeks ago, and making basically, building that out for the year ahead. We do our sales kickoff, 6 months later than that. The go-to-market teams, close to half, if not more, of the organization. So that's also another bucket of in-person. And then because we're present at a lot of cybersecurity conferences in both the US and Europe, that tends to then provide opportunities for people to gather. So, if you're in a fully remote engineering type role, you might see the team, once in the middle of the year, whole company, and then once in your geography for a holiday party in the worst case scenario. But for sales team members, you might see someone else on the team, 6 or 8 times a year, kind of by default. So I think that matters. And then I think the way you communicate, either over communicate or under communicate, depending on your culture, through Slack and through tools like email, is where a lot of your culture is built, for better or worse. So, things like Rachel, who works on my team, animates. There's a lot of like tactics you can use. So, every Friday we have on our random channel on Slack, Rachel will have like a guessing game, which will be like, which of the team members, used to be in the circus, and people give their guesses, and it's a low key, does asynchronous way of people getting to learn things that they might never have come up in a business meeting.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And we are Nuco. We're definitely not the same size as Push, but we're 20-person business, and we're always making the effort to do fun things together. We do like a charity beach clean, a arts and crafts club, and like Halloween dress up day, like all these little fun things, which actually often make the biggest impact on culture and getting to know each other and all the rest of it. So no, it's great to. I mean, we could do a whole podcast, to be honest, on that whole culture section, but we've got some other questions we've got to talk about. And I think some things that a lot of candidates will want to hear, because it's a bit of an interesting market at the moment. There's a big impact of AI. Everyone's talking about, some people talk about talent shortage. Some people talk about how there's 400, 500 people applying to jobs and not getting any feedback, and almost everyone's sort of outraged about something at the moment. Like how much, how do you describe the talent market now? Yeah, let's start with that. How do you describe it today?
Yeah, I mean, for sure, right now, it's a buyer's market on the employer side, which it hasn't been for a little while, at least not in tech. I think for sure the volume of inbound applicants is like more than I've ever seen at any stage of my career. And I think that's partly due to like discoverability, how easy it is for candidates now to basically scrap, everything on the internet and come across your ads, which in theory is good. But also leads to a high volume of sort of underqualified candidates. To your point around AI, a lot of candidates, I guess, are rightfully exploring AI tools and thinking, okay, ChatGPT or Gemini could probably write a better cover letter. I'll feed it the job ad in the company, and can they write a cover letter for me? And then on the recruiter side, you're seeing the exact same cover letter, give or take a few words, from 30 candidates in a row, and so what's actually standing out in the world of AI is what I talk about is like a simple 1 or 2 sentences that actually tell me why specifically you should get the job. I think on the candidate side, I can imagine it's everything is getting more expensive. There's I think probably more of a job shortage than talent shortage, in the absolute sense. And it can be incredibly frustrating. I've been on the receiving end of some candidate frustration where, this just happens to be the 50th job that they've got a form rejection for at CV stage. And you just happen to be the one who, they decide they're going to send their sort of, 6-page missive to. I have a lot of empathy for candidates on that side, but also recruiting teams have always been understaffed. They've always lagged elsewhere. I'm very, very reticent, if not against, wholeheartedly using AI screening for CVs.
Yeah.
And candidate scoring. The technology is just not in a good place, and so given that, you're still doing manual processes, but the AI flood on the other side, so something's got to give, and it usually is kind of quality of response or speed of response for candidates.
Yeah, it's difficult because I think it makes the need to have more conversations with candidates, but it's difficult to have that volume of conversations with the amount of people that are looking for jobs. So I think it puts both the candidate and the potential employer or recruiter in a bit of a difficult position. In terms of practical advice for candidates, both for interviewing but also for applying, you mentioned one point um, on kind of explaining clearly why you're a good fit for the role, and obviously use AI to help you a little bit, fine, but try and write it so it's a bit more authentic and comes from you. What other advice would you give to candidates, and from an interviewing and applying perspective?
Yeah, I think some of the same old tactics are always going to be true, which is if you know that the recruiter's being flooded with CVs, try and find, apply definitely through the main system because that's where everything gets handled, but try and find another way to get in contact, whether that's figuring out an email address. I used to say LinkedIn, but everybody's LinkedIn inboxes are basically unusable these days. So, but anything that basically gets the recruiter to be like, oh yeah, that's right, this is the third touch from that person, I should at least go and spend 30 seconds maybe instead of the cursory 7 seconds or no seconds if we're overwhelmed on a CV. So I think getting attention is kind of step one, but I think step two, and what happens is, we as an employer, we might go out to market and saying, okay, here's a list of stuff we think you really need to have in order to be able to do this job. And then you have 700 applications, at least half of which are actually qualified, another half that might be wrong location or just totally kind of off on seniority or area of focus. So 350 CVs where all of a sudden we go, oh, we can actually afford to add these extra criteria. Maybe we didn't need that person to come from cybersecurity, but it's a bonus. And then you have 100 CVs that come from cybersecurity and hit the other criteria. So then you've kind of got these 250 people who, in theory, based off the job ad, should be qualified for at least a first call, but because it's such a buyer's market where, we just know they're not going to float to the top. That can create a lot of candidate frustration, as you can imagine. We didn't know we could be that picky until we saw the candidate pool. And so I think for candidates, why I suggest writing like one, maybe two sentences where you quite literally, you look at the company, you look at your own experience and you say, this is exactly why I'm the perfect person. Sometimes that exercise can make you kind of go, actually, I don't even think I am the perfect person for this. And it can sometimes save you time. I understand the approach of apply everywhere and see what falls out, but sometimes, applying to fewer places with a higher quality outreach can net better results. So that's usually what I'd say. Everybody's kind of on the same side in this, even though it doesn't feel like it. All I want to do is close a role and give it to somebody who's really qualified. So, and candidates just want to find a role where they're really qualified and fit in. So it is the same goal. It's just, the odds are kind of stacked against candidates right now just from the sheer volume. But, I think great talent has always been scarce, but I think great companies have always been scarcer is probably the way I'd put it. So, the way we look at it at Push is if we truly believe that what we're building is exceptional and a generational company, then why wouldn't the very best people in the world come and work for us? And that's not like an abstract concept. That's let's go and ask everybody we would want to work with us, even if we think we've got no shot. And if they come back and say, hey, I would, but I've got 6 kids in college and I'm in a public company right now. And to be honest, until they're all in middle school, I probably couldn't. Great, cool. We'll call you in 5 years. But at least we know specifically, rather than assuming that because somebody's at a public company or because someone's done all of this, that they wouldn't work with us. And so I think you can have that mindset if you think great talent is scarce, but great companies are even scarcer. And that's where that cultural bit comes in. That's the only way you can really set yourself apart. If it's not on, someone's always going to have raised more than you. Like there's just kind
Yeah.
of no way to play that game and win.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting, and it aligns with so many of the themes that we see with our daily work as well. How do you feel candidates prepare for interviews? I know it's a bit of a bugbear for a lot of people, and it's something that we're always trying to support candidates with, but I suppose it has got to come from them. How do you feel that candidates prepare for interviews generally?
It's interesting because, again, if you're a great candidate, as in you've got a really solid track record and you're applying for jobs in your industry where you'd be qualified, or you've decided you're open for a move, and so potentially you have an agency presenting you to a bunch of different roles. On the one hand, candidates can tend to be really clear about their own background and reason for looking, but then might be a bit like, hold on, which company is this again? I always say, even if we understand the reality that you're probably speaking to 6 or 7 companies, for the 30 minutes that we're chatting, make out as if this is the only company you've ever heard of and the only one you care about. Like it is a game on the one hand. I always I tell friends who are interviewing that a first interview is really like if you've already landed a first interview and somebody's giving you 15 to 45 minutes of their time, they want you to succeed. No recruiter gets on that call is like, can't wait to weed some people out and get some no's, right? All you want is a great interview. And all candidates really need to do at that stage is avoid what I call like scoring an own goal. Have a coherent background. Don't dwell upon anything that's particularly negative or a little bit unclear on that front. The recruiter will dig in if need be, and a lot of recruiters might not. They might not realize that's even a thing. If you make it a thing, we're going to make it a thing. So, on that front, have a clear backstory, have a clear reason for leaving that ideally doesn't trash your former employer or anything like that. Have a couple of really key points about why you do specifically want to work at that company. And if you don't really specifically want to work at that company, that's something to be thoughtful about. And then I think afterwards also, there's some baseline things, which is, read what's available on the company website. Often in startups, all we're looking for is a couple of, well-placed references to things where we go, yep, tick, they've opened our website at least once. And that could be as blatant as citing the exact tagline that we use or going 3 pages deep in the blog and saying, okay, great. Luke Jennings did a webinar. You say Luke Jennings did a webinar, we're going to think that maybe you've watched it, and so there's a lot of tactics that just, make recruiters go, yeah, great, we need to chat with this person. So yeah, avoiding own goals, doing the bare minimum of research is usually where it's at. And then having a coherent backstory, about kind of how you view your career and where you're headed next.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think it's great, really concise advice. How do you think candidates should handle having multiple offers on the table? That's one that we see all the time, obviously. A lot of the great candidates have multiple offers. Sometimes it's candidates might exaggerate them for their own effect, right? That's part of it. But how do you think candidates should address it with businesses that they're interviewing with?
Yeah, I mean, a question I like to ask in really early interviews of candidates is, do you already have an idea of, imagining all things go well and you have multiple offers? Do you already know what criteria you're going to use to rank them? And I ask that question specifically because I assume most people haven't thought about it at that stage, and that makes them think about it and put their own words on it, which is very much like a sales process where you kind of say, what's the decision-making criteria? What's your timeline? And so then when I get candidates who say, what I really care about is, having autonomy. That's the one thing that's been missing and I would care about. I want to have autonomy. I care about the people I work with, and I want the products. I've been burned by products that, weren't as good as the company said they were. Okay, awesome. Now I know how I'm going to position or not my offer. If a candidate says, okay, listen, yeah, bunch of kids in school, the number one thing that's going to matter is going to be financials. If we know, particularly that talking to later stage companies, what I might even do at that stage is say, if that's your number one thing, for sure, we're probably not going to land as the highest financial offer. What I'd suggest is we actually don't go forward right now. You see this process out and look, come back and chat with me. We're going to be growing over the next 6 months and things like that. So I will say, and it's not to say that it's not a valid way to decide between offers at all. It's just being really acknowledging where your company is likely to have the edge or not, and just being transparent about that. And I think for candidates, what we try and do on our side is say, hey, here are the steps in the process. Today, this is this step. Here's when you should hear, end to end, we can run it in this amount of time. How does that stack up against other processes you have going on? And, candidates, imagine we've run our entire process. We're ready to go to offer on a Friday. And they say, well, I've got a third interview, next week, Friday. So I want 2 weeks to decide. For the way we move, we generally would just say, given that, we'd rather not go to offer. And we're going to continue with some other candidates, because for us, we can have an offer accepted and someone start the following Monday before this person's made up their mind. So I think managing those timelines so that processes align more or less within a couple of days is what I'd recommend to candidates, so that you have the most options.
Yeah, it's difficult though, right? Because loads of processes are getting paused or put on hold, or job titles are getting changed, or responsibilities are getting changed. But yeah, no, I agree. Try and manage it so that things conclude in the right way. I mean, I've got loads of more questions that I could ask, but I think we've probably got to move on to our final two. And Matt, if you've got any that you want to sneak in before we wrap up, then please do. I wanted to ask, you mentioned going after the best talent and how they might come from a larger business, or who knows where they're going to come from sometimes, right? So for someone who is switching industries or maybe going from a bigger company to a startup, what advice would you give them? Would you give them there? And yeah, what's the key to making that switch successful?
Yeah, so I think research is the answer. Again, in that first interview, what recruiters are looking for is that you speak our language. So if I have a candidate who is interviewing, we're under 100 people, cybersecurity startup, you have to be able to figure stuff out yourself, do more with less. You're not going to have a massive team under you anytime soon, but you are going to have all the freedom to basically implement your vision. If I get candidates who come on calls and talk about internal stakeholder management, or they talk about program management, or they say, when I say day one, who would in this role, who do you think you need to meet? And they start by saying, oh, well, what I do is map out the organizational structure and say, there are all these clues that tell me that probably you're not used to our environment, and it's going to take you weeks, if not months, to adjust. And then you might find you don't like it. So if you've already decided that you want to move from like a larger company into a startup, that's an easier switch if you're coming from the same industry. So a larger cyber player into a cyber startup, there's usually okay, great. Well, the space, you could probably flex down. Depends as well, sales roles between a startup and a larger company. That might be an easier thing to do given how external facing and your external customers, might not change as much between a startup and there versus a first hire in a role where you've been number 15 in a team every other time. For sure there's going to be a shock. So I think it's like learning the jargon. I'll get companies to say, I'll get candidates who say to me, oh yeah, you guys raised a Series D, right? And that tells me that they don't have any idea about company sizes or rounds and possibly don't speak our language. It's not like I'm trying to catch them out. It's just evidence that you're probably not going to have a great time week one. So I would say always think about, and same thing if candidates tell me they're interviewing with a massive company and us, I'll do the criteria question. I'll say, what matters most to you? And if it's, oh, well, having a massive, enablement team to help support me, okay, great, go to the bigger company. That's all I can encourage you to do. If it's, my territory was shrinking so much and I only got to work like 4 or 5 accounts, blah, 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 we say, okay, at our stage, it's greenfields. You would have the entirety of this section of the United States. So if that's what you're after, come here. So I think it's just around knowing specifically what you're looking for, and then kind of learning some of the language and things like that.
Yeah, brilliant, fantastic. And we've got to move on to our final question. I'm actually think I'm going to try and ask two in one here. What one piece of advice would you give to someone entering the security industry, but equally for someone considering a career like you've had, what advice would you give someone moving into the, people, talent, and recruitment side of things?
Yeah, I think moving into the security space, I think the most important thing to do is to just kind of understand what do we even mean by cybersecurity, and I think that's really research on the internet and understand what's changed. Good questions to ask if you're would be things like what's changed over the last 10 years in cybersecurity. What are kind of the big buckets of cybersecurity, because there's so many things. And if you're new to the industry, I would almost recommend you're better off starting on something that is more abstract. It might be things, less pure technical plays rather than necessarily diving into something incredibly nuanced. Because there's a lot of cyber products that are relatively easy to understand versus some of the more complex. And then I think for anyone who's looking to do the kind of work I do, or the advice that I also give to my team is, the number one thing you can do is understand how businesses work and what is important to businesses, and then figure out what is the people lever that helps the business get there. Because at the end of the day, all of the mistake I see is people learning how to do human resources activities, like learning how to do the motions of an engagement survey, or learning how to do performance management in isolation, or learning even like the skills of recruitment. And I think the thing that sets people apart and lets them sort of be more key to a business is the fact how they understand, the business needs to get here. Here are the people factors. What tool in the HR toolkit do I pull out to help us achieve that, and not the other way around? And I think that's where we kind of see, some game-changing difference in the function.
Awesome. Brilliant. Well, we're all out of questions for now. Thank you so much for joining us, Alison. Honestly, it was a really awesome podcast and great to hear your perspectives on everything. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.